Hello, welcome to IERLab Podcast. Now, who is IERLab? IERLab is the Influencer Ethnography Research Lab located at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. We specialize in methodologies and pedagogies of influencer research. I'm your host, Walter Lee, so let's get into today's episode. Today, we will be focusing on Nordic influencer culture. Does it differ from other parts of the world? How the countries are different from each other? And in an area that is known for gender equality, why is there still some differences in gender pay and much more? Now, today's guest is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki in Finland. She researches in areas such as strategic social media influencer communication, influencer marketing, and young people's agency on social media. She has published many journals, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Hanna Reinikainen.
Thank you.
Okay, to start off, I always usually ask our guests where it all began. So what was the reason you started to look more into Nordic influencer culture?
Yeah, well, I'm a researcher coming from a small Nordic country, Finland. And I figured that it would be important to kind of highlight the features and the elements that are characteristic for influencer cultures and their business models within this region. There's a lot of research done on influencers, for example, in the United States. And of course, many things are kind of universal when it comes to influencer cultures. And the same things that are trendy on TikTok kind of reach audiences everywhere. But then when looking at closely, I think you can start to see interesting details and differences between different markets.
Let's get into those differences. Is there a difference amongst the Nordic countries themselves in the way of content and the influence they might have? For example, it's been claimed in Sweden that Swedish influencers have a big influence on veganism.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Swedish influencers because I have a feeling that kind of the Swedish influencers, they're the ones that many influencers in the other Nordic countries kind of look up to. So if you do you remember PewDiePie?
Yes.
Very famous YouTuber. I think he has over 100 million followers.
Mm-hmm.
He's Swedish. And he actually became very popular on YouTube very early on. And then there's Matilda Djerf. She's a Swedish influencer and a fashion icon. I think she has around 3 million followers on her Instagram. Finnish influencers very rarely reach that kind of numbers. So yeah, I think the Swedish influencer culture is kind of in a league of its own. They're kind of like the royalties here in the Nordics, I'd say. Yeah. And actually, before my career as a researcher, I used to work for a communication agency that was based in Sweden, in Stockholm. And we often did influencer marketing campaigns across the Nordics. So in Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, implemented the same kinds of events or other practices. And then Sweden, they always got the biggest and the best results. They had the biggest influencers, and the followers were very perceptive to their appeals. Of course, Sweden has a larger population than the rest of the countries here. I think about 10.5 million at the moment, or 11 million, something like that. But I think that a lot of the practices and the results were pretty similar between Finland, Norway, and Denmark, and then Sweden kind of overtook us all. But other than that, I mean, I think it's a bit, I don't like to talk about differences between the Nordic countries. Instead, I see a lot of similarities between our countries.
Okay.
Like you mentioned, for example, veganism, which I think is a very interesting example. Because there are a lot of actually sustainability influencers in the Nordics. So you've probably heard of the term greenfluencers.
Yes.
Yeah, referring to those influencers who are also advocates for environmental issues. And so we have a lot of those. And then there are also many Nordic influencers who talk about issues such as feminism or body positivity and like mixed politics and personal and promotional in their content. And also, I think in terms of audiences, well, there are, of course, like cultural differences between these Nordic countries. Many things are also similar. For example, the use of social media and literacy skills and the state of media education. And so I think that the audiences of Nordic influencers are in many ways very similar. And this, of course, has also effects on their influence. So what are they able to talk about and which kinds of appeals work and so on.
Well, you said like you'd like to more concentrate on the similarities, but it is fascinating to find out as a listener that the Swedish influencers seem to be the top of the food chain when it comes to influencer in the Nordic regions. Is there some sort of reason why that is, apart from them having, some of the biggest YouTubers in the world or anything? Do you think there might be a causational situation where, Sweden just happens to have a better outreach or more charismatic or whatever it may be? Is there sort of a reason for that?
Well, I mean, it could be like a historical reason. I mean, Sweden has always been kind of like the power player in this area. I mean, but also like I think the Swedes have given us so much, like ABBA and IKEA. So,
yes, that's true.
Yeah, so I think they are very good at marketing, for example.
Yeah,
So
that's quite interesting that you mentioned marketing as a big way of getting influencers out there. And of course, everyone has heard of PewDiePie. I mean, I think I don't know if he's the biggest influencer anymore. I know that he'd definitely be up there. I think a lot of other influencers are now taking over his spot, but he was the sort of first one to reach a certain level. I think it was 100 mil, like 10
yes.
million or something like that, or 100 million. He was the first creator to do so. Then he went on different platforms. He went from YouTube to Twitch, I think. Or the other way around. I can't remember. But I know that there's probably no one who's on the internet who hasn't heard of PewDiePie. I mean,
Yeah.
he's just a massive entity on the internet. But so I kind of want to ask, what are some shortfalls that Nordic influencers face, do you think?
I think, one of the things here is language. I mean, these are very small language areas. I mean, PewDiePie has reached like 100 million followers because he does content in English, which of course like allows him for more possibilities. Like there are about 5 million people who speak Finnish as their native language, about the same amount who speak Norwegian, and I think like it's like a little bit more who speak Danish. So really, if like Nordic influencers want to create content in their own languages, they're kind of bounded by the amount of people who are able to understand them. Like it would be very difficult for a Finnish influencer to gain even like 1 million followers only by using Finnish.
Yeah.
Which is simply run out of people. And so like one of actually Finland's most successful YouTube channels is called the Hydraulic Press channel, where they put things into a hydraulic press and then they kind of explode. Yeah, it's very funny. And I think that they have around 10 million subscribers on their YouTube channel. And they of course, they speak what we call over here kind of like rally English, which kind of has a kind of a comic sound to it. And yeah, but I admire both those who use English in their content creation, but also those who stick to using their native languages, be it Finnish or Norwegian or Danish or something else. I mean, it's a choice that affects the careers of the influencers.
I didn't realize that the pressing YouTube videos came from the Nordic regions. I mean, I never thought about it, to be honest with you, but it's for some reason that keeps popping up in my feed, and I've never really understood why. Like, it is quite entertaining, but I don't know how it got into my feed. But that's interesting to know that I don't think a lot of people would know that that's from the Nordic region. So it's quite
They have a
fascinating.
lot of followers from the United States, for example, and yeah, probably have no idea that yes, this is Finnish speciality.
It's like, I guess Korea has mukbang, and then Finnish, the Finns that have like, I guess, the crushing things in a hydraulic press sort of content, which is quite interesting. Now, I was very interested to find out that even in the industry of influencers, there is a pay gap between male and female creators, and even different terms. For example, women are known as influencers, and males usually gamers or digital creators. This is something that I never thought about, to be honest with you, until I really did think about it. And you're right. I think that more women are considered influencers. Males, I don't see the male and the word influencer attached to each other very often. But I was under the impression that women creators would be on a higher wage than males, as well, pardon me for being naive, that women are the top consumers, meaning they would be on the larger end of the earning money, I guess, on the scale. But I'm not sure if you've said it, but it was said that Nordic countries are considered models when it comes to gender equality. Could you maybe expand more why there is still a difference between the pay gap, maybe?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And the discussion around gender, it's of course very relevant when talking about social media influencers and the influencer industry. As you probably know, the influencer industry has its origins in like fashion and beauty blogs in the early 2000s.
Hmm.
In Norway, by the way, these early creators were called pink bloggers,
Hmm.
which it has a kind of a condescending feel to it, right?
Hmm.
But then since then, of course, the industry has like grown exponentially, and like the value of influencer marketing globally, I think it's something like $20 billion already.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's a lot of money. And yes, this is an industry that has been led by women. And like women also follow influencers more often. And yeah, like you said, women are like more likely to follow like various purchase endorsements made by influencers.
Hmm.
And also, yes, we have a lot of very successful female influencers who've like created these entire business empires around themselves. The Kardashians are like an obvious example of this.
Right.
But then you mentioned gender equality in the Nordics, and like very interestingly, a lot of the influencer agencies in Finland are actually very much in the hands of women. So women run the agencies, and
Hmm.
they employ a lot of Instagram influencers who are female, and those in turn like address mainly female audiences.
Hmm.
And then they are studied by female researchers like myself. Yeah. But then when it comes to the agencies that mainly work with YouTubers, interestingly, these agencies always have more men. So kind of like while Instagram tilts more towards female influencers, then YouTube, tilts towards male influencers.
Hmm.
I think TikTok appears more equal, but TikTok is very different. As popularity is not based on followers in the same way as in Instagram. So
Right.
there's, I think, maybe less like identity work to be done there.
Hmm.
But yeah, I don't have like exact statistics from Finland, but globally, the statistics suggest that while female influencers do more like sponsored collaborations, still generally male influencers like in fact earn more from their collaborations. And I don't know for sure. There may be several reasons for this. One reason could be that YouTube offers the possibility to earn through ad space
Hmm.
and sponsored content, whereas on Instagram the possibility to earn is just on sponsored content. So the logic is different between these two platforms. And it might also be due to the fact that there are simply more female influencers. And like the distribution of their earnings is very uneven, like meaning that, there are probably lots of, say, female micro influencers who work on social media only part-time, thus like they earn very little. And this means that the earnings of the female influencers on average are simply smaller. But this actually leads us to another interesting discussion. Brooke Erin Duffy has written about this kind of work and labeled it as aspirational or emotional labor.
Hmm.
kind of paralleling it with these other kinds of unpaid work that women often do. And this leads to like hot questions regarding gender in the influencer industry, because it appears that the work that especially female influencers do is often belittled and even despised. It's not atypical for female influencers to hear, urges to get a real job, even though they would be actually making a very nice living. And, there appear to be people who think that everything that is wrong in the world right now is somehow embodied in social media influencers, like promotional culture or individualism or capitalism and so on. And so Professor Crystal Abedin and we've actually done interviews with Nordic influencer agencies, and the agency representatives, they kind of recognize this also, that the influencers and the influencer industry is often underestimated, and there is a certain kind of lack of appreciation. And one influencer agency CEO actually said that their agency had once been called a team of beauty pageants. So kind of like suggesting that they're just like a bunch of pretty girls doing silly things. And now if there is this kind of an attitude, it can also affect earnings. If it's like perceived that being a social media influencer is not a real job, it's very much easier to pay them less. Yeah, I guess that, like, unfortunately, as a female-led industry, the industry is often belittled, even in the Nordic countries with high gender equality. And it's getting better, but I think that there's always room for improvement here.
It's quite interesting that you use the quote, which is "get a real job." It's something that I guess has been thrown around a lot with influencers, creators, etc., etc. It's still very much looked down upon. I think personally, I think it's more of a jealousy statement that they are able to run their own business, and some people are a little bit jealous that they are able to do this. But yes, I've definitely heard the "get a real job" quote when it comes to myself, even being a content creator. And I wouldn't say an influencer, but a content creator at least. There is still this sort of thing that we look down on influencers, we look down on creators. But it was quite fascinating to hear that your comparison, obviously, where women are more on on Instagram, where the males are usually on YouTube, etc.
And podcasts.
Yeah. In podcasts, right? And it makes a lot more sense now for that. But you did mention agencies, which I'm kind of interested in. It seems that Nordic influencers tend to work more with agencies than what I see here in South Korea. They do have agencies here. However, it doesn't seem to be as much as it's reported in some of the papers that I've read. Can you explain why that is, and maybe some of the positives and negatives with working with these agencies?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. Like, I don't know a lot about the South Korean market, but like, I understand that there are like differences already, I think, when comparing the idea about who can be defined as an influencer. I mean, as far as I know, in South Korea, someone with like 25,000 followers would still be defined as a micro influencer, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, well, in Finland, that is actually a very respectable amount of followers.
Oh,
And a
wow.
person person in that range could have like a very successful, lucrative career as an influencer over here.
Well,
Yeah.
that's very fascinating to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. So of course these kind of like have an effect also. It's like who can be considered as having influence. But I think that's something that's also like characteristic to the Nordics is that the professionalization of the influencer industry is very high. Like, I don't mean that it's not similar in South Korea, but it's something that's typical for the industry over here. And I think that the influencer agencies, there are a lot of them, by the way. They act as like these like intermediaries between influencers and various brands, and they offer ease and security, I think, for both. And I think like brands can be, for example, unaware of how to contact influencers, who would be the best influencers for like when we want to talk to this specific, group of consumers. And this is, of course, where influencer agencies come in handy. And, the biggest brands, of course, regularly use advertising and marketing agencies that plan their campaigns. And then these agencies negotiate with influencer agencies. So there are oftentimes like a lot of intermediaries like involved. And then again, influencers might find it difficult to negotiate with brands or marketing agencies directly. So the influencer agencies then take care of their business deals and negotiate prices for them. And interestingly, I think in Finland, at least I'm guessing it's pretty much the same in the other Nordic countries as well. Many of these influencer agencies actually started out as, blog portals or like MCNs, so multi-channel networks, talent houses. And so they kind of had these like roster of influencers that they were managing and kind of like offering them to their clients. But now it's actually more typical that everyone works with everyone. So there are like multiple platforms now and like various kinds of campaigns and executions. So it's no longer in the interest of these influencer agency to be tied to certain influencers. They want to offer like more versatile services for their clients. I think this is an interesting development that we see over here.
I think it's quite interesting as well. In South Korea, I'm not 100% sure, but from what I hear around the areas, like the people who I, talk to who are influencers or so-called influencers, it's not so much the agency that they work with. It's more like tourists, like the government, basically, tourism Seoul or something like that. But the negatives there are they only want to obviously promote the good side of Korea, where a lot of what we call 외국인 or foreigner influences, they come over here and they want to not say bad things about South Korea, but show the real Korea of things. And those influencers are usually, or YouTubers are usually very popular. But they also get a lot of hate from South Korea as well, because I don't know about what the trolling situation like is in the Nordic countries, but in South Korea, it's very, very brutal, very brutal, especially if you say anything bad about South Korea.
Yeah, that's so I've understood. Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned the governmental organizations, because over here, the government organizations, let's say like the ministries, for example, the Prime Minister's office, they also work with influencers, but there's always the like agency always in the middle. So the government agencies also, they use influencer agencies who then, employ the influencers. So interestingly, they work as intermediaries, not just for like consumer brands, but also for the government agencies.
Extremely fascinating, Dr. Hanna. Like, I think that you've really opened my eyes up to what I didn't think was so different from the rest of the world about the Nordic influences and how they differ. But yeah, there are similarities and there are differences between Nordic and I guess the rest of the world. Every country has their own, I guess, way of influence or the way that they get out. I know that I just recently spoke about Chinese influences, and they're very different from Nordic influences and South Korean influences. So it's great to hear your opinion on the Nordic side of things. But we'll have to wrap it up for today because we're running out of time. But is there anything you'd like to promote? Example, your future studies, current works, or even like somewhere where people can contact you and talk to you about these more?
Yes, I do. Thank you for asking. So together with my dear Swedish colleague, Johanna Arnesson, she's from the University of Umeå, we have edited a book together. And the book is titled Influencer Politics at the Intersection of Personal, Political, and Promotional. And the book is like a collection of articles written by our fabulous colleagues. And the Nordic countries are a central focus in the book, but the content is not exclusively restricted to Nordic countries. But there are like very interesting chapters there. For example, about Swedish greenfluencers
Hmm.
and about how Danish influencers talk about body issues and present authenticity. And then there's even one chapter about Ukrainian influencers
Oh,
in the midst of the war against Russia.
wow.
Yeah, so very interesting chapters and very interesting ideas. We've just submitted the manuscript to our publisher, De Gruyter, and the book is coming out later this year. It's going to be open access, and I'm very excited about it.
That's excellent. That's quite interesting. I never knew that at the moment also Ukraine has their own influencer culture amidst the war, and
Yes.
I guess that would be an interesting topic to to bring up in social media and YouTube. I think a lot of people are very interested in what's happening over there at the moment, but that's where we'll have to wrap it up today. So, everyone that's listening at the moment, thank you for listening to today's episode of the IERLab podcast. Once again, I'd like to thank our today's guest, Hanna Reinikainen. And
Good.
until next time, this has been Walter Lee. You may click on your next adventure now.